go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, and I'm glad you could join us today. I'm Cliff Lynch. I'm the director of the Coalition for Networked Information, and I will be introducing this session. This is one of the breakout sessions from the last day of week 3 of the CNI Fall Virtual Member Meeting for 2020. Just to remind you, the third week of the meeting is focused on technology standards and infrastructure. And this certainly checks all of those boxes. I would remind you also that there are a number of pre-recorded sessions as well as the scheduled breakout sessions that are part of week 3. Please enjoy those as your time permits. We are recording this session. It will be available later for public access. Closed captioning is available. Please make use of that if it's helpful. There is a chat box, which you're welcome to use throughout the session. There's also a Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. You can use that to pose questions at any point during the session. We will address all of the questions after the presentations are complete. Diane Goldenberg-Hart from CNI will moderate that Q&A session. And with that, let me introduce the session itself. We have two people with us who will be extremely familiar to the CNI community. They've been important contributors for many years now. Martin Klein from the Los Alamos National Labs, and Herbert Van de Sompel, who many of you will know from when he won the Paul Evan Peters Award a few years ago, as well as his many, many contributions over the years to networked technologies and infrastructure. The topic today is the fair signposting profile. Those of you who've been following this work for a while will be somewhat familiar, at least, with signposting, which is an idea that was developed some years ago to help with the discoverability of networked scholarly resources, or indeed network resources more broadly. What's really interesting here is the way they've coupled the evolving ideas about the FAIR principles and their role in discovery. And certainly one of the great challenges of the last few years has been turning the FAIR principles into concrete practice. And they have worked out a way of recognizing those practices in a signposting profile. So I think this is going to be very helpful for us. And with that, let me just give a really warm welcome back to Herbert and Martin and turn it over to Herbert to start the presentation.
Thanks a lot, Cliff. That was a really great summary of the motivation for the work that I've been doing with a number of colleagues, including Martin, over the past couple months. So signposting itself is, as Cliff indicated, not new, but with the FAIR signposting profile, we've basically gone from a couple of loose suggestions on how to help robots navigate the scholarly web to a true implementation guideline on how to do so, and thereby indeed paying attention to the notion of FAIR. So in this cartoon that Martin will bring up now, you basically see the essence of what signposting really is about. It is about making the scholarly web more easy to navigate by machines, and doing this by literally putting signposts out, like shown in this cartoon. Like if you're interested as a bot in information about the author of a scholarly asset, follow this author sign. If you're interested in what the persistent identifier of this object is, follow the cite as sign. and so forth. So signposting, as we started it around 2015, always had this notion of let's make the scholarly web more easy to navigate for machines. It starts from the notion that landing pages are okay for human users. You know, they tell human users where to find the PDF or the data set, etc., but they're absolutely not optimized for machine use. And this is where signposting comes in. Now, signposting from the outset also has aimed for absolute simplicity in trying to achieve meaningful interoperability. And this is based on, well, the big lesson learned from 20 years of doing interoperability work is when you don't keep things simple, things will not be adopted. When you have simple things, then the chances for adoption grow significantly. So signposting is all about trying to achieve meaningful interoperability for machines to navigate the scholarly web in a very easy way. It's fully standard-based, follows the REST HETIOS, so hypertext as the engine of application state, architectural notions, and it makes use of typed web links. Those are typed links that are provided in the HTTP link header of landing pages, as we know them, and of the content resources that belong to a scholarly object. And then the link types that are being used in these type links all are registered in the IANA registry for link relation types, and all of those are defined in formal specifications, meaning robots can understand what each of these link types mean, and they are fully standardized via IETF specs and via the IANA registry. Now, HTTP links are really used. This is not some marginal technology. This is used all over the web. And here you see a DBpedia URL on which an HTTP head is being issued. And you see the response to that HTTP head. And in there you see a link header that actually contains 3 links on these different lines there under the linking. So if we look at the first one, that basically says that the resource on which we issued the HTTP head is available under this specific Creative Commons license. The second link shows us that when we access that DBpedia URI, then by default we will receive RDF XML as shown in the content type there. But there's also an alternative representation that is another RDF serialization. And then the third link there says that this URI on which we issue the HTTP head describes the city of Reykjavik, because you see there the URI /resource/Reykjavik. That is DBpedia's way to talk about the city of Reykjavik. Not only are these typed links used all over the web, they're actually really interesting because they work with HTTP head. They can be uniformly used for resources of all MIME types. So not only for HTML landing pages, but for all the content resources that are of different MIME types, you can use exactly this same approach. And again, because these links are accessible merely by using an HTTP head, no content transfer is required to see these links. So that means when you have massive resources like big data sets, or you have restricted content, you still can use this technique. Now, links, as I mentioned, can definitely be provided by value, as was shown there in the HTTP link header. But there is also a by reference approach, whereby a standalone document is published that contains a whole bunch of these links. And then that standalone document is being made discoverable, for example, from the landing page or the content resources, or both. Generally speaking, these typed links provide guidance to machines that are navigating the web and want to accomplish a certain task. And in order to accomplish that task, they will follow specific typed links. This one if I need author information, this one if I need metadata, and so on and so forth. Now, as I mentioned, signposting has been around since 2015. So what is new? What's really new is that we have turned these loose ideas of use these typed links to achieve some interoperability into a concrete implementation guideline. It's really a manual on how you can implement signposting. And it basically says which kind of links should you be providing for the landing page and which kind of links should you provide for each of the content resources. This implementation guideline is targeted at platforms that host all kinds of scholarly output. So it's not only for data platforms, as the notion of FAIR might suggest, it's also for institutional repositories, publisher platforms. So basically, it can be used across all kinds of scholarly platforms. And then the FAIR signposting profile, as Martin will show you later, has basically two levels. In level 1, we provide a concise, a rather limited set of links by value in the HTTP link header. And at level 2, we provide a comprehensive, so complete set of links by reference, so meaning in such a standalone document. And the reason that in level 1, we are not providing a comprehensive set, but rather a limited set of links, is because there is a risk if you would provide all the necessary links that your link header becomes too large and that the web server would suffocate on them. Okay, so you want to avoid that. And this is why in level 2, the links are provided by reference. So signposting definitely contributes to FAIR. It contributes to findable, accessible, reusable by informing machines what the persistent identifier of an object is, what the landing page is, where the content is, where metadata is available that describes the object, where the persistent identifiers of the authors are. But it does not do this by means of a metadata format. It does this by means of these links, and hence by providing HTTP URIs that machines can visit to find further information pertaining the object. Signposting also obviously contributes to the interoperability aspect of FAIR by providing all of this information in a uniform way. And it doesn't do this in a way that only applies to the scholarly web. Quite to the contrary, it uses the techniques that are used in the web at large. Now, signposting clearly is something that requires an investment for these platforms that host scholarly content to implement, right? Some investment needs to be made to implement the FAIR signposting profile. But as I mentioned earlier, signposting has been designed to be so simple that the investment required is really minimal. And it is confirmed by certain test implementations that have been done in a minimal amounts of time. Now, in order to create services that leverage this uniform signposting interface, obviously, again, one will need to make some investment. But the good news here is that if repositories implement this, if platforms implement this, then it means that these services only have to interface with one type of interface, not with a bunch of heterogeneous interface, meaning the barrier to entry is lower, and it creates a level playing ground for the emergence of complementary and competing services. Compare that with another approach to create services on top of repositories, which is basically saying, let the repositories just be what they are with the APIs that they have, all different APIs, and the central service provider will just deal with all of that complexity. That is possible, and I see in a lot of European projects this approach being taken. Unfortunately, the barrier to entry there is so high because the complexity of dealing with all these different interfaces is so high. And typically what you see is only one service provider can really have the resources to enter that kind of a market. So you have a monopoly and a sustainability problem in that case. And with this, I'm going to hand it over to Martin, who will in some detail describe the FAIR signposting profile to you and actually even attempt a live demo.
Yeah, thank you very much, Herbert. And so what I would like to do in the next a few minutes is give you an overview of how the signposting FAIR profile can really work in the real world. And for the sake of this presentation, please bear with me for this abstract depiction of a scholarly object as it often is represented on the web. So in the center of this graph, you have our landing page. And for example, you have a persistent identifier that if you resolve that in your web browser, you'll most likely be redirected to a landing page of a scholarly object. On the bottom of this graph, you see a number of metadata files that describe the scholarly object. On the top of it, you see a number of authors that ideally have persistent identifiers, such as an ORCID, for example. And you see on the right of this graph a number of content resources that belong to the scholarly object at large. So that's a very abstract way of looking at it. So for the sake of this presentation, at Los Alamos National Laboratory, we went out and we installed a local instance in our infrastructure of the DSpace CRIS system. And we also implemented all our signposting, the FAIR signposting profile in order to be able to give you a good idea of what can this actually look like in reality. Right? So for this sake, let me go switch windows here and show you my browser. If you navigate to dspacedemo.memento.web.org/JSPUI, you'll be able to access this demo, this pilot implementation of a very vanilla DSpace CRIS instance. You see the entry page of the system and a number of items that we have ingested into the system in order to showcase how signposting can work. So if I now just click on this link to show you the scholarly object representing our recent paper on the persistence of persistent identifiers of the scholarly web, and I open this in a new tab, switch to this tab, you'll see the typical DSpace landing page describing the scholarly object. We see a number of pieces of information provided, such as the authors, their affiliation, the abstract of the work, and we also see that there's an item associated with this object, namely the PDF document that actually represents the actual paper. I can also click on this button here that shows full item record. And here I get basically an extended view of the landing page with more metadata provided about the item. I'll see that there's a license associated with the object. I also see that the object indeed actually has a persistent identifier, right? It has a DOI right here. It has also a related data set hosted elsewhere that has an individual DOI. So all these sort of pieces, bits and pieces of information are available through the DSpace user interface. And again, that's something that a human can fairly easily digest. For a machine, that's much harder to do. And of course, also, I open this PDF document here in a new window just to give you an idea of this is a real thing. This is our PDF document really representing the paper that we wrote, right? So that's the sort of setup that we have established for the demo. And going back to my slides here, let's talk about level 1 for the signposting, the FAIR signposting profile. At level 1, all links pertaining to the landing page and also the content resources are conveyed by means of HTTP link headers. So if you dereference the landing page URI, you will get a number of link headers in return, and those convey information about the scholarly object. Some of those links are mandatory according to our profile, others are optional. The mandatory links here are indicated by the solid lines and the optional links with the dashed lines. And we see, for example, that a landing page has a mandatory link to its persistent identifier with a link relation type site as that Herbert mentioned earlier. Other links that are mandatory are links to metadata object describing the scholarly object with the described by relationship. And also mandatory is the link that would actually convey information about the type of the object. In this case, the type would be a landing page, and we highly recommend the terminology from schema.org to describe the type of the scholarly object there. Other links are optional. So for example, the link to the persistent identifier of the authors are optional in this level. The reason being is that we cannot guarantee that all authors have, or even one author of an object has a persistent identifier, hence we can't really make this link mandatory. The links to the individual content resources are at this level also optional, and there are basically two reasons for this, some of which Herbert had already alluded to. One, it is entirely possible that your scholarly object has way too many content resources, and including each of them by means of an HTTP link in the response would just be too much, right? And the other reason is that it's entirely possible also that these content resources are hosted on platforms that the publisher of the scholarly object has no control over. Hence, we have no way of accessing HTTP headers and modifying what is being returned there. And those are basically the reasons why we cannot or do not want to make those links mandatory. So those are the number of links that are contained in level 1 when talking about the landing page, the perspective of the landing page. How about the perspective of the content resources of this object? Well, two different kinds of links that are also optional. One is basically the inverse of the item relation type. It's a way for a content resource to convey, I am actually part of this scholarly object by means of conveying I'm part of this collection. That's a type collection link. And the other optional link for content resource would be to convey what sort of type it is. So am I, for example, a scholarly article or a data set? This would be other links there too. So if you will notice that these sort of graphs also represent nicely the follow your nose approach in a way that if you recall, the landing page had a mandatory link to its persistent identifier in, let's say, a DOI. If I am now content resource 1, for example, and I do convey that I am part of this landing page by means of the type collection, a machine would also now know that my persistent identifier is what I should be using in order to reference the content resource 1. Right? This is the hopping, following links and following your nose approach that machines can easily so do. So let's see what this may look like in practice. I go back to my landing page for my scholarly object in my DSpace repository, and if I can find my pointer, my mouse, there you go. Nope, what did I do? Here we go. And I copy the URL of the landing page. Come on. And I use a terminal in order to be able to use the command line tool curl to send an HTTP head request against the URL of the landing page. Right. And I'll see I get my HTTP response, including the response headers representing information that is mandatory and optional for level 1. So for example, I see my site as linked with the DOI. I see a described by link right here pointing at the metadata record. I see the link describing the type of the object. In this case, it's an about page, it's a landing page, right? And I also see a number of optional links that we have included. For example, I have the optional link for level 1 pointing at the PDF document with a relation type item, right? This is the item of this scholarly object. Both the authors have ORCIDs, so I can include those links here. And two more links that I want to highlight. One is the link with the relation type related, pointing at the dataset, hosted a fixture in this case. And also another link that is not yet part of the profile, but could very well be part of this down the road, which is the link to the associated license document with the relation type license. The discussion is currently ongoing whether that should be included or not. So I realize I need to speed up a little bit. So I go back to level 2, which is where we, as Herbert alluded to, where we convey all our links in a link set document. So all the links pertaining to the landing page and all the links pertaining to the content resources are included in a link set document. And that link set document is also discoverable by means of HTTP links. So the notion of what is mandatory and what is optional has changed slightly from between level 1 and level 2. Now for level 2, we see that the describe by links to all available metadata records is mandatory, and also the links to the to all available content resources is mandatory in that level as well. From the perspective of content resources, the previously seen optional links are now mandatory, meaning each content resource now has to convey the collection relationship, and also has to convey what sort of type it is. So whether it is a scholarly article, for example. You see new lines in this graph here, so the dashed dotted lines, if you will. Those lines represent cases you're supposed to put those links into place if and only if the conveyed information from the perspective of the content resource is different than what was conveyed from the perspective of the landing page. So for example, if content resource N has a different persistent identifier than the landing page has, then you should put in a new site as link from the content resource N to its corresponding persistent identifier, right? So a brief example of what this could look like. We go back to my link headers, because here I'd already seen that my link set document is included in the HTTP response headers. I copy that URL, go back to my browser, because looking at JSON in my browser is a little bit more friendly, and increase the font a little bit. And here you see the link set document that was returned. I'll see my landing page. I'll see the type of my landing page conveyed, the site as link towards the persistent identifier, the two authors, my described by links, a license link, my related link, and my item link pointing back at the PDF document. And also, as mentioned, the links from the perspective of the content resources are included in this document as well, here conveying that this item is actually part of that collection, pointing back to the landing page URL, and also as mandatory in level 2, conveying that it is of type scholarly article, utilizing the schema.org terminology. So with that, I go back to my slides here, and again invite you to try it out yourself. dspace.demo.mementoweb.org/jspui, a very plain vanilla dspace Chris instance, not all that hard to set up. We ingested a number of scholarly objects that we're kind of familiar with in order to give an environment to test out our signposting profile, our fair signposting profile. And I'll conclude this presentation with a quote from Luke, pointing at the simplicity of this approach. Again, a pointer to our fair signposting profile, and another pointer to a GitHub repository where we invite you to provide feedback and, for example, join the discussion about the potential inclusion of links to license documents to convey that additional information in our signposting, in our fair signposting profiles. So with that, I'll end here. We're very appreciative of your time. Thanks a lot for listening. We're most happy to foster a discussion and answer questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Herbert, for that wonderful presentation. Indeed, the possibilities with this approach seem very exciting indeed. And with that, the floor is now open for questions. I would like to invite our attendees to please enter your questions in the Q&A box, and our presenters will be happy to respond. So just a quick question while we're waiting for our attendees to type in their questions. Actually, Martin, I was wondering, would you mind dropping the URL to the demo site in the chat? I have a feeling folks would appreciate that and enjoy playing around with that site a little bit. And if I understand correctly, this approach is already in production, right? I mean, are there organizations already making use of the protocol?
So there's been early adopters of signposting in general. And when you go to signposting.org, you actually will see a list of organizations, platforms that have implemented the early signposting approach. When it comes to the FAIR signposting profile, there's no real implementations yet, but there are things ongoing. So Martin's experiment that he just demonstrated at DANS, we are currently working in the context of a European project called EOSC Hub on an implementation of the FAIR signposting profile for the B2 Share platform, which is based on Invenio. That is also the basis of Zenodo. And then there is enormous interest in implementing it for Dataverse platforms also. So at DANS, we use Dataverse, but there's other Dataverse customers, let's call it, that are also really interested. So I wouldn't be surprised that in the next coming weeks, we start implementation there. But it's still very early days. The spec has basically been out only for, I think we started this 3 months ago, and it's been evolving still quite a bit recently.
Great. Okay, thank you for that.
And that also kind of informed our decision to install, for the sake of this demo, a DSpace Chris instance, because that was kind of the missing link sort of thing. So we are very interested now in, we have colleagues that are very involved in the development of the core DSpace code. And so we're in touch with our friends and colleagues there to see how our lessons learned for implementing the FAIR signposting profile can be morphed and merged into the core code of DSpace and other platforms there too.
Got it. That's great. Thank you very much. I appreciate that clarification. I see that we are a little bit past time here, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording of the presentation, but first I'd like to thank Martin and Herbert one final time for sharing this good work with us here at CNI. We really appreciate this presentation, and also to our attendees for making time to be with us here at CNI's Fall 2020 meeting. We hope we'll see you back. But my understanding is that Martin and perhaps Herbert for a little bit will be able to hang around. If people want to stay back and ask questions or make comments, please feel free to do so. Join the conversation, just raise your hand and I'll be happy to unmute you. And with that, I will bid everyone a good rest of your day and hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.